The bitter December wind cut through the streets of downtown Chicago, making even the well-dressed professionals hurry along the sidewalks, their coats pulled tightly around them. Holiday lights flickered in the distance, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers that towered over the city. Christmas was only a few days away, and the festive atmosphere clashed with the harsh reality of those who had nowhere warm to go. David Carter pulled his coat tighter around his frame, shoving his hands deep into his pockets as he made his way toward the subway station. It had been another long day at Reed Enterprises, where he worked as a mid-level financial analyst. The company's annual holiday gala was happening that night, and he should have been excited. At least that's what his colleagues kept telling him. But for David, it was just another event where the executives would sip expensive champagne and pat themselves on the back for a year of record profits, while employees like him remained invisible. He was about to turn the corner when he spotted her. A woman sat hunched on a subway vent, her arms wrapped tightly around herself in a feeble attempt to keep warm. Her clothes were worn and layered, but they weren't enough to combat the freezing wind. Long, unkempt hair framed a face that had once been beautiful, but was now weathered by hardship. She wasn't begging for money, didn't hold up a sign like so many others on these streets. She simply stared ahead, lost in thought. David hesitated. He had seen plenty of homeless people in the city, some asking for help, some trying to disappear. He had never stopped before. What was different this time? Maybe it was the way she held herself. The way her eyes, though tired, did not look defeated. There was something out of place about her, something that didn't quite fit. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward. "Hey," he said, his breath visible in the cold. She didn't respond right away, as if it had been a long time since someone actually spoke to her. Slowly, she turned her head, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "Do you need anything?" he asked, suddenly feeling awkward. The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's a complicated question," she murmured. Her voice was smooth but laced with exhaustion, as if she had once spoken with confidence but had long since lost the energy to do so. David wasn't sure how to respond. "Well, I'm heading to an office party. It's, a company thing. Indoors, warm. There'll be food." He hesitated. "Would you like to come with me?" The woman blinked, clearly surprised by the offer. "You're inviting me to a corporate Christmas party?" David shrugged, suddenly feeling foolish. "I guess so. I mean, it's not a big deal. Just, if you want a break from all this." He motioned vaguely to the cold, the street, the whole situation. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she let out a quiet chuckle. "That's new," she murmured. David wasn't sure what that meant, but before he could ask, she nodded. "All right, let's go." She stood, brushing off her coat, and for the first time, David noticed something odd. Her posture, straight-backed, elegant despite the circumstances, wasn't what he expected from someone who had been living on the streets. And when she finally met his gaze directly, there was something else. Something sharp, something hidden beneath the surface. David wasn't sure what he had just gotten himself into, but there was no turning back now. David led the woman toward the nearest department store, an idea forming in his head. She followed without protest, though her sharp eyes scanned their surroundings, as if she was used to assessing danger before it arrived. Inside, the warmth hit them instantly, and David saw her exhale in relief, though she said nothing. The store was decorated for the holidays. Twinkling lights, garlands wrapped around pillars, and an artificial fireplace flickering in the background. The contrast between the luxurious interior and the woman beside him, dressed in layers of worn-out clothes, was stark. He stopped near the women's section, turning to her. "If you're coming to the party, you'll need something to wear." She raised an eyebrow, arms still crossed over herself. "Are you trying to clean me up so I don't embarrass you?" David blinked at the bluntness of her words. "No, that's not," he sighed. "I just figured you might want to feel comfortable. Warm." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "All right." David expected her to hesitate, maybe pick something plain, but instead she walked straight to a black dress, simple but elegant, as if she knew exactly what she was looking for. She held it against herself, looking at her reflection in a nearby mirror. The transformation was almost instant. Even in her worn-out coat, he could see it now. The grace, the presence. Who was she? Good choice, he said cautiously. She gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I used to know how to dress for these things. There it was again, that cryptic edge to her words. David paid for the dress, then took her to a nearby cafe so she could change and freshen up. When she finally stepped out of the restroom, he felt his breath catch for just a second. The woman who had been sitting on the cold pavement just minutes ago now looked completely at home in this world. Not like someone who had been struggling, not like someone who was used to begging, like someone who had once belonged to the world of wealth and power. David's curiosity deepened, but he pushed it aside. Shall we? He asked. The woman smirked, tilting her head slightly. After you. Arrival at the party, the Reid Enterprises Holiday Gala was held at the Regency Grand Hotel, a 5-star venue reserved for the city's elite. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, and servers carried trays of champagne between the corporate giants that mingled across the room. David had been to these events before, always as a background character, never the star. He was just another mid-level employee, blending into the crowd. But this time, all eyes turned to them as they entered. His colleagues stared, their murmurs barely concealed. The woman at his side, now wearing the elegant black dress, commanded attention without even trying. David felt the shift immediately. People recognized her, or at least, they thought they did. From across the room, Elliot Graves, the CEO of Reid Enterprises, froze mid-conversation. His usual charismatic facade slipped for just a second, his eyes locking onto David's companion. The woman met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she smiled. David had no idea what was happening, but the game had just begun. David felt the shift in energy the moment they stepped into the Regency Grand Ballroom. The clinking of champagne glasses, the hum of polite conversation, and the soft melodies from the string quartet. All of it seemed to pause for just a second as heads turned toward them. Not toward him, toward her. The woman he had invited, Samantha Reid, though he still didn't know her name, walked beside him with an air of quiet confidence, as if she belonged here. David had been expecting pitying glances from his colleagues, maybe some awkward whispers about why he had brought someone so out of place. Instead, he got something far worse: recognition. People were staring at Samantha like they had seen a ghost. From across the room, Elliot Graves, the CEO of Reid Enterprises, stiffened. His normally polished expression cracked for just a fraction of a second, something dark flashing in his eyes before he quickly composed himself. David leaned toward Samantha, lowering his voice. What's going on? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was locked on Elliot, a small, almost amused smile playing at her lips. Then she turned to David and said, Your boss looks like he's seen a demon. David barely had time to process that before an older woman in an emerald green gown approached them. Samantha? The voice was breathless, disbelieving. David turned to see Vivian Caldwell, one of the company's senior board members, staring at Samantha as if she couldn't trust her own eyes. Samantha smiled politely. Mrs. Caldwell, you look well. Vivian's expression hardened. How dare you show your face here? The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder. David's stomach twisted. What the hell had he just walked into? Vivian's sharp words drew even more attention. Guests were now whispering in hushed tones, exchanging glances between Samantha and Elliot Graves, who still hadn't moved from across the room. David, caught between confusion and unease, finally spoke. What's going on here? Vivian scoffed, turning to him for the first time. Who are you? David Carter. I work in the finance department. He gestured toward Samantha. He hesitated. We came together. Vivian's eyes narrowed, flicking between him and Samantha. Then she turned back to the woman beside him, voice laced with bitterness. If you have any dignity left, you'll leave. Samantha didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up a glass of champagne from a passing server and took a slow sip, as if she had all the time in the world. Now where's the fun in that? She mused. David wasn't sure whether to be impressed or terrified. You shouldn't be here, Vivian pressed. After everything, Everything? Samantha tilted her head. You mean after I was stripped of everything? After I was declared unfit to lead my father's company? After I was erased? A collective hush fell over the immediate area. David felt his heartbeat in his throat. Vivian paled, glancing around as if suddenly realizing how many people were listening. I won't discuss this here, she hissed. Not in public. Why not? Samantha raised an eyebrow. Elliot didn't seem to mind making it public when he stole my company. The entire room fell silent. David inhaled sharply. Her company. Elliot Graves finally stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral, but there was an unmistakable tension in his posture. Samantha. His voice was smooth, controlled. I see you found your way back. Samantha gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Surprised? David watched as the CEO and the homeless woman he had met just hours ago locked eyes like two rivals meeting on the battlefield. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Samantha Reid wasn't just some woman down on her luck. She was someone Elliot Graves feared, and that changed everything. For the first time since stepping into the ballroom, David felt the weight of something far bigger than himself pressing down on him. Just this morning, he had been a nameless employee, another face in the corporate machine of Reid Enterprises. Now he stood in the middle of a confrontation between the company's CEO and a woman who had been erased from its history. And somehow, he had been the one to bring her back. Samantha swirled the champagne in her glass, her posture deceptively relaxed, but David could see the sharp calculation in her eyes. Elliot Graves, always the master of charm and control, had recovered quickly. His face was pleasant, neutral, but his grip on the drink in his hand was just a little too tight. I didn't expect to see you again, Samantha. Samantha's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. That's funny. You should have. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Who is she? What does she mean? Why is Elliot acting so stiff? Vivian Caldwell, still pale and tense, placed a hand on Elliot's arm. We should handle this privately. Elliot didn't acknowledge her. His eyes remained locked on Samantha, as if assessing how much damage she could cause by simply being here. David, standing beside her, felt completely out of his depth. Samantha, he said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation. Maybe we should... She cut him off with a single glance. No, David, I'm right where I need to be. And then, without breaking eye contact with Elliot, she raised her glass and took another slow sip. A challenge. The CEO's jaw tightened. Finally, he spoke, his voice even and controlled. Why don't we take this somewhere more private? Samantha tilted her head. What's wrong, Elliot? Afraid of a little audience? David wasn't sure how much longer this standoff could last before someone called security. But before Elliot could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Samantha? David turned to see a man in his late 30s, wearing an expensive navy suit, stepping forward from the crowd. His expression was one of disbelief and something dangerously close to regret. Samantha finally looked away from Elliot, her lips pressed into a thin line. Richard. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. David didn't know who Richard was, but he could see it. The tension between them was thick, like something unfinished and painful was sitting between them. Richard took another cautious step forward. You're alive, Samantha's eyes darkened. No thanks to you. David felt another wave of shock hit him. What the hell did that mean? Richard's face twisted with guilt, but before he could say anything, Elliot stepped in smoothly. As I said, the CEO said, voice perfectly composed, we should talk somewhere private. Samantha let out a slow breath. Then, for the first time since walking into this party, she turned her gaze to David. For a second, he saw something soft beneath the sharp exterior. A silent question. Are you with me? David didn't hesitate. He gave a single nod. Samantha turned back to Elliot and smiled. Lead the way. The tension in the air was suffocating. As Elliot Graves led the way through the lavish corridors of the Regency Grand Hotel, Samantha walked beside him with an air of quiet authority. She wasn't just following him. She was controlling the room without saying a word. David trailed slightly behind, his heart pounding. Just an hour ago, He had been just another employee, ready to get through the night unnoticed. Now he was being pulled into something much bigger, something dangerous. Behind them, Richard Vaughn and Vivian Caldwell exchanged quick, hushed words before following. The group entered a private conference room, an elegant space with dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. A long mahogany table sat at the center, its polished surface reflecting the dim chandelier light above. Elliot gestured to the chairs. "Sit." Samantha didn't move. Instead, she walked to the window, her arms crossed as she stared at the city below. It was the first time she looked conflicted. David had a feeling it wasn't the view she was seeing, it was the past. Elliot exhaled sharply. "All right, let's end this charade. What do you want?" Samantha turned, her gaze sharp. "You stole everything from me." Vivian winced. Richard looked away. "Elliot?" He only smirked. "I didn't steal anything. You left." The words hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. David saw Samantha's fingers tighten against her arms, but her voice remained controlled. "I didn't leave, Elliot. I was erased." Silence. Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "So dramatic. Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" Samantha tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Do you?" For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Elliot's eyes. Uncertainty. Vivian leaned forward, her voice lower now, edged with something almost pleading. "Samantha, why now? After all these years, why come back?" Samantha took a slow breath. "Because I finally found proof." David barely had time to process those words before Elliot's entire demeanor shifted. The smirk was gone. His hand curled into a fist on the table. "That's impossible," Samantha smiled. "No, Elliot, it's inevitable." David sat frozen, watching the silent war unfolding before him. What the hell had he stepped into? Richard cleared his throat. "Samantha, listen. I don't know what you think you have, but don't." Samantha's voice cut through the room like ice. "You had your chance to help me 5 years ago, Richard, and you didn't." The guilt in Richard's expression was undeniable. David's mind raced. 5 years? What happened 5 years ago? He turned to Elliot, expecting some counterattack, some grand denial. But to his surprise, the CEO wasn't looking at Samantha anymore. He was looking at David, and in his eyes, for the first time, David saw recognition, understanding, and worse, realization. David wasn't just some nobody in the room anymore. He had brought Samantha back, and that made him a problem. David swallowed hard as Elliot's gaze lingered on him. It wasn't just a look, it was an assessment, a silent calculation of whether David was a threat or just collateral damage. Samantha noticed it too. She stepped forward slightly, putting herself between David and Elliot, as if silently warning the CEO to back off. Then she spoke. "You should be worried, Elliot." Elliot let out a slow breath, as if regaining control of himself. "Even if you had something, Samantha, no one would believe you. You're just a ghost, a forgotten heir to a company you were never fit to run." Samantha's smile didn't waver. "We'll see." David's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about corporate betrayal. This was a full-blown power struggle, one that had been buried for years. But why now? Why had Samantha waited so long to return? As if hearing his thoughts, Richard exhaled and finally spoke again, his voice heavy. "You don't understand, Samantha. You were supposed to stay gone." Silence. Then Samantha laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm sure that was the plan." David tensed as Samantha reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "This," she said, holding it up, "is why I came back." Elliot's eyes locked onto it instantly, his jaw tightening. David wasn't sure what was on it, but based on Elliot's reaction alone, he knew it was big. Vivian paled, looking between Samantha and Elliot. Richard's grip on the table tightened. Something was wrong. David could feel it. And then it happened. The door burst open. 2 security guards stormed into the room. David barely had time to react before one of them grabbed his arm, shoving him against the table. Samantha was already moving, twisting away from the second guard, her instincts sharp, practiced, as if she had been preparing for this moment. Elliot stood calmly adjusting his cufflinks. Did you really think I'd let you walk out of here, Samantha? David struggled against the grip on his arm. What the hell are you doing? Elliot turned to him with an almost sympathetic look. You made a mistake getting involved in this, Carter. Vivian's hands trembled on the table, her face filled with regret. This doesn't have to get worse, Elliot. But the CEO ignored her. Samantha was still fighting, managing to elbow the guard in the ribs. He stumbled back, and in that split second, she grabbed David's wrist. Run! She yanked him toward the door, the flash drive still clutched in her free hand. David didn't hesitate. They bolted. The moment Samantha yanked David out of the conference room, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some corporate drama anymore. This was a manhunt, and they were the targets. The luxury hallway outside the conference room was eerily empty, but the distant sound of footsteps pounding against marble floors told them one thing: security was coming. Samantha didn't hesitate. She tightened her grip on David's wrist, pulling him into a sprint toward the service exit. Where are we going? David managed between breaths. Somewhere that isn't here. David wasn't a runner, and his mind was still struggling to catch up to reality. Just hours ago, he had been worried about office politics and Christmas party gossip. Now he was running for his life with a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. As they rounded a corner, Samantha skidded to a halt, nearly colliding with a security guard coming from the opposite direction. The man's eyes widened in surprise, but only for a second. His hand moved toward the radio clipped to his belt. Samantha acted first. She grabbed a decorative vase from a side table and smashed it against his head. David froze as the man stumbled, his knees buckling before he collapsed to the ground unconscious. Samantha didn't waste time. She crouched down, grabbed his radio, and switched it off before tossing it aside. David stared at her. Where the hell did you learn to do that? She shot him a sharp look. 5 years on the streets teaches you things. A chill ran down David's spine. Just who was she before all of this? Before he could ask, Samantha grabbed his arm again and kept running. The exit sign ahead glowed red. They were almost out. But just as they reached the door, 2 more guards appeared, blocking the exit. David cursed under his breath. Samantha turned to him, her voice low but urgent. Can you fight? David hesitated. I mean, I played soccer in college? Samantha groaned. Useless. Before the guards could react, she pulled something from inside her coat, a small canister of pepper spray. With one swift motion, she sprayed it directly into the face of the first guard. The man yelled in agony, stumbling back, rubbing at his eyes. The second guard lunged toward Samantha, but David, without thinking, stepped forward and swung his fist. It was not a good punch, but it was enough to throw the man off balance for half a second, long enough for Samantha to land a sharp kick to his ribs. The man crashed into the door, his head smacking against the frame. He didn't get up. David stood there, his hands shaking slightly. Holy shit! Samantha didn't give him time to process it. She pushed open the door. Move! The cold night air hit them instantly as they stumbled into a dark alley behind the hotel. The moment they were outside, David's adrenaline started to crash. What had he just done? What the hell was happening? Samantha turned to him, her breath visible in the cold air. We need to go. Now. David exhaled sharply. He had a choice. He could walk away, pretend this never happened, or he could follow her down the rabbit hole. He looked at the unconscious guards inside, the security team that was probably still searching for them, and then he looked at Samantha, at the way her hands trembled slightly, but her face stayed cold and unreadable. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for something bigger. David clenched his jaw. Lead the way. Samantha nodded once. Then they disappeared into the night. David had no idea where they were going. The Chicago night air bit at his skin, and his legs burned from running, but Samantha moved with purpose. She led him through a maze of side streets and back alleys, avoiding main roads, always checking over her shoulder. She wasn't just escaping, she was calculating. David couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't random luck. This wasn't just a woman who had been living on the streets. She knew exactly what she was doing. After nearly 15 minutes of running, Samantha finally slowed down. She led him into a deserted parking garage, the only light coming from flickering overhead bulbs. David bent over, hands on his knees trying to catch his breath. Jesus, do you ever stop? Samantha ignored him. She was listening, waiting. David straightened, following her gaze toward the entrance. No security, no pursuit. For now. She exhaled, finally allowing herself to relax. Just slightly. David took the moment of stillness to turn to her. All right, enough. What the hell is going on? Samantha gave him a look, the kind that made it clear she had been expecting this moment. You wanted the truth, she said. David's pulse pounded in his ears. He wasn't sure if he wanted the truth anymore, but there was no turning back now. He nodded once. Samantha pulled the flash drive from her pocket. This is everything, David frowned. Everything what? She hesitated for just a second, then handed it to him. David stared at the small device in his palm. It was ordinary, simple, but if Elliot Graves had been willing to send security after them, it had to be anything but. He looked back at her. What's on it? Samantha's gaze hardened. Proof that my father was murdered. David's breath caught. Everything stopped for a second. The night air, his thoughts, the pounding in his chest. Then, what? Samantha's voice was steady. My father, Arthur Reid, didn't die of natural causes. He was killed. David shook his head, his mind struggling to catch up. This wasn't just about corporate corruption. This wasn't just about power struggles or legal battles. This was murder. Samantha watched him carefully, waiting to see if he'd run. He should. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to go back to his normal life and forget this night ever happened. But then he thought about Elliot Graves, the way the CEO had looked at him, like he was a loose end that needed to be tied up. David was already involved, and he knew deep down there was only one way forward. He clenched his fist around the flash drive and looked Samantha in the eye. Show me. Samantha nodded, and just like that, David stepped into a war he never saw coming. This chapter solidifies the stakes. It's no longer just about corporate betrayal, it's about life and death. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Uncovering the Past. David stared at the flash drive in his palm, the weight of it feeling far heavier than it should. Proof that Arthur Reid was murdered. The words echoed in his mind, looping over and over. He looked at Samantha, searching for any hint of hesitation, any sign that she wasn't sure. But there was none. Her jaw was set, her gaze unwavering. This wasn't just some wild theory. She believed it, and that meant it was real. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. We need to see what's on this. Samantha nodded. I know a place. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. David hesitated. You live here? Samantha gave a short, humorless laugh. No one really lives here, but it's safe. She led him inside, up a flight of stairs with flickering lights, past doors with peeling paint, and finally to a small one-room unit with a second-hand couch, an old desk, and a cheap coffee maker. David couldn't help but wonder, was this where she had been hiding for the past 5 years? Samantha didn't give him time to ask. She went straight to the desk, plugged in an old laptop, and inserted the flash drive. David sat beside her, his pulse thudding in his ears. The screen flickered and a folder appeared, labeled Reid Case Files. Samantha clicked it open. Inside were dozens of documents, emails, and audio recordings. David leaned closer, his eyes scanning the list. Then one file caught his attention. A video, labeled Arthur Reid Final Statement. Samantha's breath hitched. She hadn't seen this before. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad for half a second. Then she clicked. The screen went black for a moment. Then Arthur Reid appeared. Arthur Reid sat in what looked like his office, but something was off. His normally polished suit was slightly rumpled, and there was a tension in his face that David didn't recognize from the framed pictures that hung in the Reid Enterprises building. He looked afraid. The video timestamp read 5 days before his death. Arthur took a shaky breath and spoke. If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. David felt a chill creep up his spine. Samantha sat frozen beside him, her fingers digging into the armrest of the chair. Arthur continued. I know what's coming. I've tried to fight it, but I can't stop it. Elliot Graves has orchestrated everything. David's stomach dropped. Arthur leaned closer to the camera, his voice urgent. They're going to frame my death as natural causes, a heart attack, but it won't be real. I don't know if I'll be able to stop them, but if you're watching this, someone needs to finish what I started. His expression darkened. Elliot won't stop until he owns everything. And if Samantha is still alive. Arthur's voice broke for a second, but he quickly regained control. Then she's in danger, because she's the only one who can take him down. The video cut out. Silence. David could hear his own breathing, the sound of Samantha's heartbeat pounding in the room. Arthur Reid had known. He had tried to warn someone. And now, after all these years, his words were finally being heard. Samantha slowly closed the laptop, staring at the blank screen. Then she spoke, so softly David barely heard it. He knew they were coming for him. David swallowed. And now they're coming for you. Samantha's fingers tightened around the desk edge. Not if I get to them first. David leaned back, his head spinning. Elliot Graves had killed Arthur Reid, or at the very least orchestrated it, and Samantha had been the only real threat left standing, which meant that's why they erased her. David exhaled sharply. This changes everything. Samantha's hands curled into fists. Number, this confirms everything. She pushed away from the desk, pacing the small apartment, her mind racing. David could see it. She was already planning her next move. Finally, she turned to him. We need to get this to the press. David hesitated. The press? Yes, Samantha said firmly. We leak it. The video, the files, everything. If this goes public, Elliot won't be able to cover it up. David rubbed a hand over his face. That's assuming anyone believes us. Elliot controls most of the corporate media. He'll twist this however he needs to. Samantha's jaw tightened. Then we don't go to the corporate media. We go underground. David frowned. What does that mean? Samantha crossed her arms. I know someone, an investigative journalist. If we give this to her, she'll run with it. David wasn't sure how he felt about that. If this was really as dangerous as it seemed, then exposing the truth meant putting targets on their backs. And something told him that if Elliot Graves had been willing to kill once, he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Before David could respond, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Both of them froze. It wasn't the front door, it was the fire escape window. Samantha snapped to attention, reaching into the desk drawer and pulling out a small concealed knife. David's heart pounded. Are we expecting company? Samantha didn't answer. She moved cautiously, pressing herself against the wall as she reached for the edge of the curtain. Slowly, carefully, she pulled it aside. David's stomach tightened. Standing outside on the fire escape was a man in a dark coat, his face partially shadowed beneath the dim streetlights. But when he leaned closer, Samantha let out a small breath of relief. It's okay, she murmured. I know him. She unlocked the window and slid it open. What the hell are you doing here? The man climbed inside, brushing off the cold. His face was sharp, worn by years of experience, and his eyes flicked between Samantha and David with quick calculation. Nice to see you too, he said dryly. We need to talk. Now. David crossed his arms. And you are? The man smirked. Name's Marco. Let's just say I know a few things about the people trying to kill you. Samantha exhaled sharply. Great, because we were just about to go after them first. Marco's expression darkened. Then you're already running out of time. Marco's presence changed everything. David watched as the man dusted off his coat and scanned the apartment with sharp, assessing eyes. He moved like someone who was used to being watched, someone who had spent years living in the shadows. Samantha crossed her arms, her expression tense. How did you find us? Marco smirked. You're not as invisible as you think. David didn't like that answer. Who are you? He asked, stepping forward slightly. And why do you care about what's happening to us? Marco leaned against the desk, arms crossed. I used to work for your friend Elliot Graves. David's breath caught. What? Samantha's face didn't change, but David could tell she was just as caught off guard. Marco sighed. I wasn't always on the right side of things. I ran security for Reid Enterprises back when Arthur was still alive. When Elliot took over, I stayed on, until I saw what was really happening. He looked at Samantha. I knew your father, Samantha, and I know for a fact he didn't die the way they said he did. Samantha's fingers tightened against her arms. You knew? Her voice was steady, but David could hear the anger just beneath the surface. Marco held her gaze. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have proof. David frowned. Then why are you here now? Marco exhaled. Because Elliot knows you have the flash drive. Silence. Samantha's posture stiffened. How? You weren't exactly subtle back at the gala, Marco said dryly. Word spread fast. By now, Elliot's already put things in motion. David felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Meaning? Marco's expression darkened. Meaning there's a hit out on both of you? David's pulse spiked. A hit? As in dead, Carter. Marco sighed. You have about 6 hours before every lowlife Elliot keeps on his payroll comes looking for you. David felt sick. Samantha, however, remained still, processing the information with unnerving calmness. Then she spoke. Then we need to move now. Marco nodded. I have a safe house outside the city. We lay low there, get a plan together. David was still trying to process the fact that people wanted him dead. He was just an office worker. But as he looked at Samantha, composed, calculating, he realized something. She had been living with this fear for years, and yet she was still standing, still fighting. He took a deep breath. All right, he said. Let's go. Samantha glanced at Marco. How do we get out without being seen? Marco smirked. I have a car parked 2 blocks away, but we can't take the streets. They're already watching. We take the back alleys. Samantha nodded. Lead the way. Marco moved toward the door, peering through the peephole before unlocking it. He stepped out first, scanning the hallway. David's heart pounded in his ears as he followed them out. The moment they stepped into the dimly lit corridor, he felt it, the weight of danger pressing down on them. And then, a noise, footsteps, getting closer. Marco's expression hardened. Move, now! They sprinted for the back stairwell. David had no idea where this was going to end. But one thing was clear. They were officially being hunted. The stairwell was cold and damp, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of rusted metal. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete, but Marco moved like a ghost, barely making a sound as he led the way down. David, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. His heart pounded in his chest and his mind raced through worst-case scenarios. He had never run for his life before. Never thought he'd have to. Samantha, meanwhile, was silent but focused, her body tense like a coiled spring. Marco reached the bottom first, pressing his back against the door leading to the alley. He raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He was listening. David held his breath. Then, the faint sound of voices outside. Low, controlled, men waiting. Marco muttered a curse under his breath. He turned to Samantha, voice barely above a whisper. They're already here. David's stomach dropped. Samantha didn't even blink. She looked up at the stairwell they had just ascended, then at the door, considering their options. They were trapped. Marco's fingers twitched toward his belt, where David now noticed a concealed pistol tucked into a holster beneath his jacket. David's breath hitched. Hold on, are we shooting our way out? Marco gave him a flat look. Not unless you have a better idea. Samantha exhaled slowly, then shook her head. Too risky. There's another way out, through the basement storage rooms. We used them as escape routes back when this place was a squatter hub. Marco raised an eyebrow. You really have been everywhere, huh? Samantha didn't respond. She was already moving, leading them toward a rusted door marked maintenance access. Marco followed, but not before pulling out his gun and clicking off the safety. David swallowed hard and followed. The storage level was dark and cramped, filled with old furniture, discarded office chairs, and metal shelving units covered in dust. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, the silence pressing against their ears. Samantha moved with confidence, weaving through the maze of debris, her footsteps careful. David, on the other hand, nearly knocked over a metal crate. Marco shot him a glare, and David held up his hands in apology. Then, footsteps above. Heavy, purposeful. Their pursuers were inside the building. Samantha picked up the pace. reaching an old service door at the far end of the storage room. She jiggled the handle. Locked. David's stomach twisted. "Tell me you have a key." Samantha pulled out a rusty multi-tool, shoving it into the lock. Marco turned back toward the room's entrance, gun raised, his body still and focused. Above them, the voices were getting closer. David clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Hurry!" Samantha ignored him. She was steady, methodical, her hands not shaking as she worked the lock. Then, a faint click. She pushed the door open. Marco grabbed David's shoulder. "Go! Now!" David didn't need to be told twice. He slipped through the door, stepping into another alley. This one much narrower and darker than the first. Samantha and Marco followed, shutting the door behind them. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the distant sound of shouting from inside the building. They had been discovered. Samantha turned to Marco. "Where's the car?" Marco pointed down the alley. 2 blocks west. If we keep to the shadows, we can make it before they sweep the streets." Samantha nodded. "Then let's move." David took a deep breath and followed. There was no turning back now. The city never truly slept, but at this hour the streets were as quiet as they would ever be. Dim streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the alley as Samantha, David, and Marco moved quickly, keeping to the darkness. David's legs burned, his lungs aching from exertion, but he forced himself to keep going. Stopping wasn't an option. Marco led the way, his movements precise and practiced. He had done this before. That much was clear. David wasn't sure whether that made him feel safer or more afraid. Behind them, sirens wailed in the distance, a stark reminder that the city was awake and searching, not for just any criminals, but for them. Samantha suddenly grabbed David's sleeve, pulling him behind a dumpster as headlights swept through the alley. David pressed himself against the cold metal, holding his breath as an unmarked black SUV slowed near the alley entrance. Inside, 2 men sat in the front seats, scanning the streets. David stiffened, his heart hammering. These weren't cops. They were something worse. Marco's voice was barely a whisper. "They're Elliot's men." Samantha didn't move, her body tense but controlled, waiting for the right moment. The SUV idled for a second longer, then the driver cursed, tapped on the dashboard, and the car sped off down the street. David let out a slow breath, trying to stop his hands from shaking. Marco checked his watch. "They're searching the grid. We have maybe 10 minutes before they loop back." Samantha nodded. "Then we keep moving." They slipped back into the shadows, sticking to back alleys, avoiding street cameras and open intersections. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted like prey. And the worst part? They had nowhere to run. After another 10 grueling minutes, Marco finally led them to a rundown auto shop at the edge of the industrial district. A neon sign flickered above the garage door, reading Clark's Auto Repair, though it looked like the shop hadn't been operational for years. Marco pulled a key from his pocket, unlocking a side door. "In now." Samantha slipped inside first, David close behind, Marco locking the door behind them. The interior was dark, cluttered, the smell of old oil and rust thick in the air. A few workbenches lined the walls, and in the center of the garage sat an old rusted-out sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in a decade. David looked around. "This is the safe house?" Marco smirked. "It's safe enough." Samantha, however, was already on high alert. She moved toward the office space in the back, flicking on a small desk lamp. The light cast long, eerie shadows, illuminating the dust-covered papers, old monitors, and a corkboard pinned with newspaper clippings. David stepped closer, his eyes scanning the headlines. "Corporate takeover, Reid Enterprises under new management. Arthur Reid dies of heart failure. Business world mourns. Elliot Graves rise to power, a legacy redefined." His stomach twisted. Marco had been watching Elliot for years. Samantha turned, her expression unreadable. "How long have you been tracking him?" Marco leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "Since the day I left. I knew he wasn't clean, but I didn't have proof." He nodded toward the flash drive in her pocket. "Until now." David ran a hand through his hair. "So what's the plan? We send this to the journalist you mentioned?" Samantha hesitated for the first time. She glanced at Marco, something unspoken passing between them. Marco sighed. There's a problem. David's chest tightened. Of course there is. Marco turned to Samantha. Your journalist friend? She's already dead. Silence. Samantha closed her eyes for half a second, absorbing the blow. Then she whispered, When? Marco exhaled. Yesterday morning. Car accident. But I checked. Her brakes were cut. David felt sick. Samantha opened her eyes, her expression colder than David had ever seen it. Elliot knew she was our way out. David swallowed. So now what? Marco pushed off the desk. Now, we find another way, fast. Samantha nodded, her voice firm. Because Elliot isn't going to stop until we're dead. David could still hear the words echoing in his head. Your journalist friend? She's already dead. He wasn't built for this. Corporate deadlines, office politics, those were the kinds of battles he was used to fighting. But running for his life? Cover-ups? Murder? He had no business being here. And yet, he was. Samantha turned toward Marco, her eyes sharp. How did you find out? Marco sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I still have contacts in the city. A cop I trust flagged it as suspicious. The moment I heard, I knew it was a message. David swallowed. A message for who? Marco's gaze was grim. For anyone else thinking about helping you. The weight of those words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Samantha exhaled, gripping the desk's edge. For the first time, David saw the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way the past 5 years of running and surviving had carved themselves into her bones. But she didn't break. Instead, she straightened. That means we're out of time. Marco nodded. We need to move now. This place isn't safe anymore. David frowned. How would they even find us here? Marco and Samantha exchanged a look. Then, something outside shifted. David froze. Footsteps. The unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under boots. Marco immediately pulled his gun, moving to the window and peeking through the blinds. David could see the tension in his shoulders. He saw something. Samantha grabbed David's wrist, pulling him back toward the storage area in the back of the garage. We have to go. Now! David barely had time to process before... Bang! A gunshot ripped through the silence, shattering one of the windows. David's body instinctively dropped to the ground, heart hammering. Marco returned fire, ducking behind a workbench. More footsteps, more shouting. They were under attack. Samantha grabbed the flash drive from the desk, shoving it into her pocket. David's breath was ragged. What do we do? Samantha's eyes scanned the room, her mind working fast. Then she grabbed a set of keys from under the desk and tossed them to Marco. We take the car. David blinked. What car? Samantha pointed to the rusted-out sedan in the middle of the garage. David stared. That thing runs? Marco smirked, bullets ricocheting off metal around them. Guess we're about to find out. Samantha and David raced toward the car, Marco firing off a few more shots before diving into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. Marco slammed the gas pedal just as the garage door exploded open. David caught a glimpse of figures in black tactical gear, weapons raised. Then they were flying out onto the street, tires screeching against pavement. Bullets pounded against metal, shattering the back windshield. David ducked, Samantha reached for the dashboard, and Marco gritted his teeth, weaving through traffic. They had escaped, but barely. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. The car raced through the city streets, tires screeching as Marco swerved between lanes, narrowly avoiding late-night traffic. David's breath came in sharp gasps, his body still shaking from the gunfire. The shattered back windshield let in the icy night air, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him from feeling the cold. Samantha sat in the front passenger seat, her fingers gripping the dashboard as she glanced behind them. Are they still following? Marco asked through clenched teeth. Samantha scanned the darkened streets. Not yet, but they will be. We need to disappear. David shook his head, trying to process. Where the hell do we even go? Elliot's men are everywhere. Samantha didn't answer immediately. She was thinking, calculating. Then she turned to Marco. Do you still have contacts with the underground networks? Marco gave a tight nod. Some. But not many, I trust. Not with this kind of heat. David leaned forward, his pulse still racing. Wait, underground networks? Like criminals? Marco smirked. Like survivors, Carter. David opened his mouth to argue, but then a set of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Samantha saw them first. They found us, Marco cursed. Hold on! The car lurched forward, the old engine groaning as Marco slammed his foot on the accelerator. The SUV behind them gained speed, headlights glaring like predatory eyes. David gritted his teeth, bracing himself against the door as Marco took a hard right turn down an abandoned industrial road. We can't outrun them in this piece of junk, David shouted. Samantha turned sharply toward Marco. Take us to the old train yard. Marco's jaw tightened. He didn't like the idea. That place is a death trap. Samantha didn't flinch. Exactly. Marco exhaled sharply, then yanked the wheel. David had no idea what was waiting for them at the train yard. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to end quietly. The old rail yard was a wasteland of rusted train cars and abandoned machinery. It had once been a hub for transportation, but now it was nothing but a skeleton of its former self, forgotten by the city. Marco killed the headlights as they barreled into the yard, the car bumping over old tracks before coming to a screeching halt behind a line of rusting cargo containers. Samantha was already moving, throwing open the door and stepping into the darkness. David hesitated. What now? Samantha turned to Marco. Give me the gun. Marco pulled a spare pistol from his jacket and handed it to her, without a word. David's pulse jumped. Whoa, wait! What's the plan here? Samantha's expression was cold and focused. We make sure they don't walk away from this. David's stomach twisted. Are we seriously doing this? We should be running. Samantha cut him off, stepping close, her voice low and sharp. There's nowhere left to run, David. Her words sank in. She was right. Either they ended this now, or they'd be hunted for the rest of their lives. David swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod. Samantha turned back to Marco. Get in position. We only get one shot at this. David watched as Marco disappeared into the shadows, moving with military-like precision. Then Samantha turned to him one last time. Stay close to me, and whatever happens, don't freeze. David barely had time to nod before the sound of approaching engines filled the air. Their enemies had arrived, and now it was time to fight. David crouched behind a rusted-out train car, his breath uneven, hands trembling as he gripped the cold metal. This wasn't supposed to be his life, but here he was, waiting in the dark, about to fight for survival. Samantha knelt beside him, calm, controlled, her eyes locked on the approaching SUVs as their headlights cut through the thick fog of the train yard. Marco was positioned somewhere on the other side, waiting for the right moment. The first vehicle rolled to a stop, the second pulling in behind it. The engines cut off. Then silence. David held his breath. The doors opened slowly and 6 men stepped out, all dressed in black tactical gear. Their movements were coordinated, professional. These weren't just hired thugs. These were Elliot Graves' best. One of them, a man with a scar along his jaw, pulled out a radio. We have the location. Moving in. Samantha's grip tightened on the pistol in her hand. Then before they could take another step, Marco struck first. From the shadows, a single shot rang out, hitting one of the men in the leg. He collapsed with a pained grunt, gun falling from his hand. The others reacted instantly, raising their weapons, scanning the darkness. Samantha didn't hesitate. She stepped out from cover and fired twice, hitting another man in the shoulder before ducking behind a metal beam. Chaos erupted. David flinched as bullets ricocheted off metal, sparks flying in the darkness. He had never been in a gunfight before, and every instinct screamed at him to run. But there was nowhere left to run. Instead, he pressed himself lower, trying to control his breathing. Samantha reloaded her gun, yelling over the gunfire. David, move! David snapped out of it and bolted toward the next train car, barely dodging a shot that shattered a rusted window behind him. Marco took down a third man, but the remaining attackers regrouped quickly, their tactical training evident. One of them, the man with the scar, spotted Samantha, raising his rifle. David's heart lurched. Without thinking, he grabbed a metal wrench from the ground and hurled it at the man's head. It connected with a sickening crack. The man stumbled, gunfire spraying wildly as he hit the ground. Samantha didn't waste the opportunity. She fired a single shot, taking him down before he could recover. David stared at his own hands, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Did I just do that? There was no time to think. Only 2 men remained, but they were falling back, realizing they were outmatched. Marco stepped from the shadows, gun trained on them. Drop your weapons. The men hesitated, then complied, tossing their guns to the ground. It was over, for now. Samantha walked toward the 2 remaining men, guns still in hand. David saw it in her face. She wasn't going to let them go. David's stomach twisted. Wait. Samantha didn't look at him. They'll come back. Elliot won't stop until we're dead. The men stayed silent, but their expressions made one thing clear. They were loyal to Elliot until the end. Marco sighed, lowering his gun slightly. She's right, Carter. We let them go. We'll be fighting them again in a few hours. David felt sick. He had already crossed lines tonight that he never imagined. But was this what survival looked like? He looked at Samantha, her jaw set, her hands steady. She had been fighting this war alone for years, and now she was asking him how far he was willing to go. The decision was his. David clenched his fists, and then he made his choice. David stood frozen, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The 2 surviving men, Elliot's operatives, knelt on the gravel, their hands still raised from when they surrendered. Their weapons lay discarded a few feet away, but their eyes burned with defiance. Samantha's pistol was still trained on them, her grip steady, her finger just hovering over the trigger. David knew what she was about to do, and he had to stop it. Wait. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Samantha didn't look at him. They won't stop. David's fist clenched. Neither will we. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Marco exhaled, stepping beside Samantha. He's not wrong. Killing them doesn't solve anything. It just makes us like him. Samantha's jaw tightened, but for the first time, David saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt. She lowered the gun an inch, but her expression remained hard. We let them go, and they'll tell Elliot everything. David stepped forward. Then let's make sure they don't want to. The 2 men exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from defiance to uncertainty. Marco smirked. I like where this is going. He crouched down in front of them, his voice dropping to something dangerously smooth. You know who we are. You know what we have. You also know what happens if Elliot finds out you failed. The men stiffened, because they did know. Elliot Graves didn't tolerate failure. Samantha crossed her arms. So here's the deal. You walk away now, you disappear. You don't go back to him, and you don't speak my name again. David could see the hesitation in their faces now. They were killers, yes, but they were also survivors, and they knew there was no winning for them in this fight anymore. Finally, one of them gave a slow, reluctant nod. The other followed. Samantha hesitated for a moment longer. Then she stepped aside. Go. Neither man wasted time. They grabbed their wounded, backing away carefully before disappearing into the darkness. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't victory, but it was the closest thing to one they were going to get tonight. Samantha holstered her gun and turned toward the others. We need to move, now. They piled into Marco's car, leaving the burned train yard behind. David was still processing everything that had happened, but there was no time to dwell. Marco glanced in the rearview mirror. Where to? Samantha didn't hesitate. We need a new plan, and I know exactly where to go. David frowned. Where? Samantha finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. To someone who hates Elliot Graves even more than we do. David's stomach tightened. Something told him this next move would change everything. Marco drove in silence, the car cutting through the empty streets as they headed toward the outskirts of the city. David shifted uncomfortably in the back seat, his mind racing with questions. Who exactly are we going to see? Samantha glanced at him, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze back out the window, her fingers tapping lightly against her thigh. A nervous habit David had never seen before. That wasn't a good sign. Finally, she spoke. A man named Victor Langston. David frowned. That name is familiar. Marco snorted from the driver's seat. It should be. He used to be Elliot's business partner. David's breath caught. Wait, you mean the Victor Langston? The one who... The one who Elliot betrayed and forced out of the company? Samantha finished for him. David knew the story. Everyone in the corporate world did. Victor Langston had been one of the founding executives of Reid Enterprises, working alongside Arthur Reid himself. When Elliot had taken over, Victor was suddenly ousted, his reputation destroyed overnight. Most assumed Langston had fled the country or retired in shame. But now, David stared at Samantha. You're telling me he's still around? Samantha nodded. Not just around, he's been waiting. Marco gripped the wheel tighter. You really think he'll help us? Samantha's voice was flat. I think he'll do anything for revenge. David's stomach twisted. They were about to walk into something dangerous, but there was no turning back now. They arrived at a gated estate on the outskirts of the city. David expected a mansion, but instead they pulled up to a fortress. Tall, reinforced fencing surrounded the property. Security cameras were positioned at every angle, and as Marco rolled to a stop at the gate, two armed guards stepped forward. One of them tapped on the driver's side window. Marco rolled it down just enough to speak. We're here to see Victor. The guard gave them a long, scrutinizing look before finally nodding toward a camera above them. Step out. No weapons. Samantha and Marco reluctantly handed over their firearms, while David simply raised his hands. I don't even own a weapon. Marco smirked. That's why you're still alive. They were led through the gates past a modern yet imposing estate and into a lavishly decorated study lined with bookshelves and antique furniture. And there, seated in a leather chair by the fireplace, was Victor Langston. Time had weathered him, but he still had the commanding presence of a man who had once controlled an empire. He looked up as they entered, his gaze settling on Samantha first. Then slowly he smiled. Well, well, the lost heiress returns? Samantha didn't flinch. And I'm here to make you an offer. Victor chuckled, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. I'm listening. Samantha stepped forward, voice steady. We have proof that Elliot killed my father, and we need your help to take him down. Victor's eyes darkened. The room was silent. Then, he set his glass down, leaned forward and spoke. Tell me everything. David exhaled slowly. They had just made a deal with the devil. And now, there was no going back. Victor Langston leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes studying Samantha carefully. David had been in plenty of business meetings before, but never one where the stakes were life and death. Samantha remained calm, controlled, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. She had a history with Langston, one that hadn't been spoken aloud yet. Finally, Victor exhaled. You're telling me you have proof that Elliot Graves murdered Arthur Reid? Samantha nodded. Not just proof, undeniable evidence. His own words, his own mistakes, all on this flash drive. Victor smirked. And you want my help? After all these years? David frowned. There was an unspoken challenge in Victor's tone, something he couldn't quite decipher. Samantha didn't waver. I want your resources, your influence, your network. You still have power, Victor. And you want revenge. Victor chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. You know me well. David shifted uncomfortably. They were bargaining with a man who had once played the same game as Elliot. Could he really be trusted? Victor set his drink down and stood, walking to the massive window overlooking the estate grounds. You know, he mused, when Elliot forced me out, I thought about killing him myself. I had the means, the motive, but something stopped me. Samantha crossed her arms. What stopped you? Victor turned back to them, smiling. I realized that some men don't deserve a quick death. They deserve to watch everything they built burn. David felt a chill run down his spine. Samantha didn't react. Then we're on the same page. Victor studied her for another long moment, then sighed dramatically. All right, you have my attention. What's your plan? Samantha placed the flash drive on the table. We leak this to the public, not just the media. Elliot controls too much of that. We go underground. Whistleblower sites, independent journalists, the dark web if we have to. Victor arched an eyebrow. That's bold and reckless. Samantha didn't flinch. It's the only way. The moment this goes live, Elliot's empire crumbles. Victor tapped his fingers against the desk, considering. Even if you leak this, Elliot still has power. He won't go down without a fight. Samantha nodded, which is why we hit him where it hurts. She pulled out a second folder, sliding it toward Victor. David leaned in. He hadn't seen this before. Victor opened it, scanning the contents. His eyes darkened. Well, he murmured. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, embezzlement. Samantha smirked. Elliot's been hiding money for years. If we expose this alongside the murder evidence, it won't just be a scandal, it'll be a financial collapse. Victor let out a low whistle. I have to admit, Samantha, I underestimated you. She raised an eyebrow. I get that a lot. David, still processing the weight of what they were about to do, rubbed a hand over his face. And what happens after we release all this? Samantha turned to him. Then we survive long enough to see him fall. David's stomach twisted, because something told him Elliot wasn't going to let that happen without a war. Victor exhaled, setting the folder down and turning towards Samantha. You're right about one thing. This will destroy him, but it also puts a target on your back that's 10 times bigger than before. David's chest tightened. Elliot already wants us dead. This just speeds up the process. Victor smirked. I like the way you think, Carter. David wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a threat. Samantha ignored them both. The key is timing. If we release everything at once, Elliot won't have time to control the damage. Victor nodded. I can make the necessary connections. The second this goes live, Elliot's empire will collapse in on itself. Marco, who had been leaning against the wall in silence, finally spoke. Then we better be ready for his counterattack. He won't go quietly. Victor chuckled darkly. Oh, I'm counting on it. Samantha's expression remained cold, focused. How fast can you get this out? Victor checked his watch. Give me 6 hours. After that, the world will know who Elliot Graves really is. David exhaled. And what do we do in the meantime? Victor's smirk widened. You get ready for the storm. 6 hours. That was all the time they had before Elliot knew his empire was crumbling. Samantha, David, Marco, and Victor sat around a dimly lit table, going over their next steps. Marco checked his weapons, loading fresh magazines into each one. We need an escape plan, somewhere to fall back to if things go south. Victor smirked. Already taken care of. I have properties outside the city, but trust me, Graves won't have time to come after us once this drops. David wasn't convinced. You're underestimating him. Samantha nodded. He's right. Elliot will retaliate. And when he does, he won't just come after us. He'll come after anyone who ever worked with us. Victor sighed. You always were the cautious one, Samantha. David raised an eyebrow. Wait. Always? Victor's smirk faded. Samantha didn't react. We don't have time for old stories. David wasn't so sure about that. But before he could ask, Marco's phone buzzed once. A single text. It's done. The files are live. David's stomach dropped. Samantha stood, her face unreadable. Then it started. Victor lifted his glass. To war, then. David didn't drink, because deep down he knew this was just the beginning. And when Elliot found out, Elliot Graves always prided himself on control. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had none. The screen in front of him displayed breaking news headlines from every major independent outlet. His name was everywhere, tied to corruption, embezzlement, and murder. His face remained stoic, but his fingers clenched against the edge of his desk. Someone knocked, a sharp, urgent rap. Elliot didn't have to guess who it was. Richard Vaughn, his longtime fixer, stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't the smooth, confident man Elliot relied on. He was shaken. It's everywhere, Richard said, not even bothering with pleasantries. Elliot swiped across the screen, scrolling through leaked bank transactions, audio recordings, and emails, all damning evidence. His empire wasn't just under attack. It was collapsing. He turned slowly to Richard. "Who did this?" Richard exhaled shakily. "Samantha Reid." Elliot's jaw tightened, but he didn't react immediately. He should have seen this coming. She had survived too much, fought too hard. And now, she had finally won. Or at least, she thought she had. Elliot leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Find them." Richard hesitated. "Elliot, the media." Elliot's eyes darkened. "Find them." Samantha watched the world burn from a dimly lit apartment above an old convenience store. David paced beside her, his nerves on edge. "We actually did it." The news cycle was nonstop. Reporters dug through every crime, every scandal, every financial manipulation. Investigations were already being opened. Board members were resigning. Stock values were plummeting. Elliot Graves was finished, or at least that's what David wanted to believe. Samantha wasn't celebrating. Marco, standing near the window with his arms crossed, let out a sigh. "Now we wait for the response." David stopped pacing. "Response?" Samantha turned to him, eyes cold, calculating. "Elliot's not done yet. He won't just run. He'll retaliate." David exhaled sharply, his stomach twisting. "So what do we do?" Samantha glanced at Marco. "We make sure we're ready when he does." David rubbed a hand over his face. "We just took down one of the most powerful men in the country, and somehow, that's not enough?" Samantha's expression didn't change. "Not until he's gone for good." Marco checked his phone and cursed under his breath. "We have a problem." David tensed. "What?" Marco turned the screen toward them. A live security feed from Victor Langston's estate. David's heart plummeted. The estate was under attack. Black SUVs crashed through the gates, men in tactical gear moving in, weapons raised. Elliot's counterattack had begun. Samantha grabbed her gun, voice steady. "We need to go. Now." David felt the cold weight of reality settle in his chest. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marco drove like a man possessed. The car raced through the darkened streets, weaving through late-night traffic as they closed the distance to Victor Langston's estate. David's hands clenched into fists, his mind struggling to catch up. This was supposed to be over. They had exposed Elliot, brought everything into the light. But instead of falling apart, he had gone to war. Samantha sat in the front seat, her face a mask of steel, her grip tight around the pistol in her lap. She had known this was coming. She had been waiting for it. Marco's phone buzzed again, and he pressed it to his ear. "Talk!" A voice crackled on the other end. "Victor. Get here fast, they're inside." Marco hung up, jaw tight. "It's bad." Samantha didn't hesitate. "Then we fight." When they arrived, the estate was already in chaos. The once grand mansion was lit up with gunfire, shadows moving across the windows. Several of Victor's guards lay motionless on the front steps. David's stomach turned. Marco killed the engine, reaching under the seat for a duffel bag of weapons. He tossed Samantha a fresh clip and handed David a knife. David stared at it. "You're kidding." Marco smirked. "It's that or nothing, Carter." David swallowed hard. He wasn't a fighter, but tonight he didn't have a choice. Samantha moved first, slipping through the side entrance while Marco covered their flank. Inside, the halls were a battleground. Gunfire echoed through the corridors, furniture overturned, bullet holes marking the once luxurious walls. David stayed low, his pulse hammering in his ears. Through the chaos, Victor stood in the center of the main hall, a rifle in his hands, barking orders at his remaining men. His eyes landed on Samantha. "Took you long enough." She didn't waste words. "Where's Elliot?" Victor reloaded. "Upstairs, but he didn't come alone." Samantha nodded. "Then let's finish this." She moved first, disappearing up the grand staircase. David hesitated for half a second, then followed. At the top of the stairs, the doors to Victor's personal study were open. Inside, Elliot stood waiting. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was ready to end this. Samantha stopped just inside the doorway, her gun aimed at his chest. "It's over." Elliot smiled. "Not quite." David felt the shift in the air a second too late. From the shadows, two of Elliot's men stepped forward, guns raised. Samantha didn't blink. David froze. Elliot tilted his head, watching them like a predator with his prey. "You thought you could destroy me?" His voice was smooth, calm. "I built this empire. You think a few headlines can bring me down?" Samantha's grip tightened. "Number, but a bullet will." Elliot's smile didn't falter. "Then do it." David's heart pounded. Elliot had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in the room. Elliot Graves stood calmly in the center of the room, his hands resting casually at his sides. But there was nothing casual about the tension in the air. David could feel it, the weight of the moment, the unspoken threat lingering between them. Two of Elliot's men flanked him, their weapons trained on Samantha and Marco. The standoff had begun. Samantha didn't lower her gun. "This is over." Elliot tilted his head slightly, his smile never wavering. "If it were over, I'd be dead already." David could hear his own heartbeat, feel the sweat on his palms. Elliot was playing his final move, and he knew it. "You think killing me will fix everything?" Elliot continued, voice smooth. "You think you're better than me?" Samantha didn't flinch. "Number, but I know the world will be better without you in it." Elliot laughed, a quiet, knowing sound. "Then do it." David saw Samantha's grip tighten. She was seconds away from pulling the trigger, but Elliot wasn't afraid, because he had one more card to play. "Before you do, you should know, there's someone else in this house." Samantha hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Elliot's smirk widened. "You didn't think I'd come alone, did you?" Marco swore under his breath. "Damn it." David's stomach dropped. Someone else was here, and that meant they weren't safe yet. The moment of hesitation was all Elliot needed. He moved fast, lunging toward one of his guards. A gunshot rang out. David didn't know who fired first. Everything erupted into chaos. Samantha took down one of Elliot's men, but the other fired back, forcing Marco to take cover behind a bookshelf. Elliot ducked out of sight, moving toward the hallway. He was running. David's mind screamed at him, "Move, move, move!" Without thinking, he bolted after him. Samantha yelled something behind him, but David barely heard it. All he could focus on was stopping Elliot before he disappeared for good. He sprinted down the corridor, heart hammering. Elliot was fast, but David was faster. He tackled him just before he reached the exit, slamming him into the wall. Elliot struggled, twisting violently, his elbow catching David in the ribs. Pain shot through David's side, but he didn't let go. Not this time. They crashed to the floor, both gasping for breath. Elliot reached for something, a knife strapped to his ankle. David saw it a second too late. The blade swung toward him. And David grabbed Elliot's wrist just in time. The two men grappled on the ground, the knife inches from David's throat. Elliot's strength was unnerving, fueled by desperation. David gritted his teeth, using every ounce of strength to push back. He saw the look in Elliot's eyes, a mixture of rage and finality. One of them wasn't getting up from this. David didn't want to kill him, but if he didn't, Elliot would. And so, with a final burst of strength, David turned the knife and drove it straight into Elliot's chest. Elliot gasped, his body jerking as the knife sank deep into his chest. David felt the resistance, the warmth of blood spreading over his hands. For a moment, everything slowed. Elliot locked eyes with him, and in that instant, David saw something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not fear, just acceptance. Like Elliot knew this was always how it would end. He tried to speak, but no words came. Then slowly, his body went still. David sat there, chest heaving, his hands trembling over Elliot's unmoving form. For the first time since this all started, it was over. Samantha and Marco rushed in, weapons still drawn. Samantha's eyes landed on Elliot, then flicked to David. She understood immediately. David expected to feel something. Relief, satisfaction. But all he felt was exhaustion. Marco crouched beside him, pressing two fingers to Elliot's neck. Then he exhaled. "He's gone." The words rang in David's head, but they didn't feel real. Samantha slowly holstered her gun. She should have looked victorious. Instead, she just looked tired. She turned toward David, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Come on, it's time to go." David hesitated, staring at the lifeless body of the man who had once been untouchable. Elliot Graves had ruled with fear, manipulation, and power. And now, he was just another dead man on the floor. David let out a slow breath. Then he stood and left Elliot Graves behind. The next morning, the world woke up to a very different reality. The media was exploding with the fallout. Elliot Graves was found dead in Victor Langston's estate. The leaked evidence had destroyed everything he built. His remaining allies were abandoning ship, trying to save themselves. The world finally knew the truth. Samantha, David, and Marco watched the coverage from a safe house miles away, hidden from the chaos. Marco sipped his coffee, eyes on the screen. "Well, it worked." David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "We should feel something, right? Like relief?" Samantha didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "It's never that simple." She was right, because even though Elliot was gone, the scars remained, and they always would. David turned to Samantha. "So what now?" She exhaled, looking out the window, where the sun was slowly rising over the city. "Now?" She gave him a small, tired smile. "Now, we start over." Months later, the world had moved on. Reid Enterprises was under new leadership. Corruption had been unearthed and purged, and Samantha had finally reclaimed her place. But she didn't take back the company. Instead, she walked away. David found her one morning, standing by the water's edge, looking at the skyline with something like peace in her eyes. She turned to him, smirking. "Still think you were just an office worker?" David chuckled. "Number. But I do think I need a vacation." Samantha laughed softly, and for the first time in years, she was free.